They always say start from the beginning, but beginnings are boring in America. People remember endings, especially messy ones. So I am telling this story in reverse, the way you might rewind a tape you do not want to watch but cannot throw away. The end came under fluorescent lights in a community center gym that smelled of sweat and floor wax. It was the annual town hall, the kind where people argue about recycling bins and pretend we are a family of neighbors instead of strangers who nod at each other while mowing the lawn. That night, I stood behind a beige microphone with a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand and announced in a calm, almost cheerful voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, my wife is a cheating wife, and she has been sleeping with my uncle." There was no laugh track, though one would have been appropriate. A couple in the back gasped so loud you would think I had just declared war on Christmas. Someone coughed in slow motion, the way people do when they want to be a sound effect. I felt like a politician confessing on C-SPAN at 3 a.m, broadcast to insomniacs and drunkards. But I was sober, and worse than sober, I was clear. I said betrayal out loud. I said infidelity out loud. I said toxic love, and the room rippled like a pond when you throw in a rock too heavy for its size. Then I did something very American. I held up the evidence in PowerPoint form. Yes, I had made slides. I am the kind of man who processes heartbreak by making bullet points. Slide 1. A blurred screenshot from a Ring camera showing my wife slipping out of my uncle's house with a towel on. Slide 2. A receipt from a motel with her name and his credit card. Slide 3. A meme of Homer Simpson disappearing into the bushes because I needed the audience to laugh at least once. Otherwise, they would think I was insane. I told them this was not just cheating. This was a conspiracy that had played out in our cul-de-sac for months, maybe years. It was the kind of betrayal that turned a family into a cult of silence. They played me like a fool, I said, but the fool keeps receipts. That is when Mrs. Jenkins, a woman who has lived across the street for 30 years, fainted onto a table of brownies. That was the ending. Now, rewind to the middle. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a kind of Tuesday that does not promise anything. The sky was a default blue, the kind Microsoft sets on your desktop when it cannot find the Wi-Fi. I came home early from work, carrying a rotisserie chicken sweating inside its plastic dome. That chicken was supposed to be dinner, and instead it became the Greek chorus of my life. When I walked past my uncle's driveway, I saw her car parked crooked behind his truck. I thought nothing of it. Family helps family. That is the American motto, right? I opened the back door to return a socket wrench he had lent me, and that is when the sitcom turned into a horror show. The sound was laughter, but not the kind that heals. It was the kind of laughter you hear in a bad parody film, exaggerated, gasping, like somebody pretending to drown in joy. I pushed the door open, and there she was, my wife, the woman I once promised to love until the suburbs crumbled, running out of his bedroom naked, clutching a pillow to her chest as if it could erase the cheating written all over her skin. My uncle stood behind her, half-dressed, mouth forming excuses that evaporated before they left his lips. Time slowed down in American detail, the smell of barbecue sauce still lingering in his kitchen, the hum of his old refrigerator, the squeak of the screen door. And me, frozen, holding a plastic dome of poultry like a shield in a medieval war. That was the moment betrayal became not an abstract concept, but a household object. Infidelity smelled like chicken grease. Toxic love looked like bare feet slapping across linoleum. Family suddenly meant enemies with shared DNA. I did not shout. I did not swing. I became an audience member in my own life, watching the episode unfold with no commercial break. She darted past me, hair wild, eyes refusing mine, and disappeared out the back into the alley. He stuttered something about a misunderstanding and therapy exercises, as if Americans strip naked to solve their problems every Tuesday. I left the chicken on his counter and walked out without closing the door. Later, our neighbor Greg told me he saw the chicken sitting there when he dropped off the HOA newsletter. He thought it was funny. The chicken of betrayal, he called it. He told everyone at the next barbecue. In this country, even your heartbreak becomes a potluck joke. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, turning like the wheel of misfortune. My wife did not come home until after midnight. She smelled of perfume and fear. She crawled into bed like nothing happened. When I asked her where she had been, she said, "Book club." Yes, book club. As if the book they were reading was called Infidelity for Beginners. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because sometimes your only revenge is laughter. The next morning, she made pancakes for the kids and kissed me on the cheek. A sitcom reset, betrayal packaged as domestic bliss. I watched her flip pancakes and thought, this is how cults work. They give you sugar after the poison. They convince you the conspiracy is in your head. And for a moment, I almost believed her. Almost. But America does not forgive cheating wives, not when the evidence is as loud as a naked sprint through your uncle's ranch-style house. Not when betrayal is baked into the community gossip like raisins in potato salad. It grows. It metastasizes. It knocks on your door with a casserole and whispers, "We heard." That is when I decided I would not be the fool forever. That is when the plan for revenge began to crawl out of the shadows like a late-night infomercial you cannot stop watching. And so you see why I started at the end. Because the end proves the beginning was not a hallucination. The end proves that infidelity is not just a private wound, but a public performance in this country. The end proves that a cheating wife and a treacherous uncle can turn a family into a sideshow, and the only way to reclaim your dignity is to narrate it yourself loudly in front of people who would rather be eating brownies. That was part one. The discovery, the absurdity, the rewinding of a life until the tape frays. Betrayal made me a fool, but a fool who documents. Revenge is not violence. It is narrative, and this America is only the beginning. It turned out that the suburban truth is not hidden behind curtains, but mounted right beside them in the form of doorbell cameras that never sleep and talk to each other like gossiping birds across telephone wires. So the morning after the cafeteria confession, I drove to the hardware store and bought a small constellation of legal surveillance and told myself it was not paranoia, but choreography. Because if betrayal had danced through my rooms like a badly planned flash mob, then I would answer with a rehearsal of my own. The man at the counter asked if I was upgrading for safety, and I said yes, and he nodded in the American way that means he hopes I am not talking about raccoons. Back home, I screwed lenses into eaves and calibrated angles so that the house looked less like a home and more like a patient being prepared for surgery. And the dog watched with that quiet loyalty that makes you forgive everything you cannot forgive. I told the cameras to remember what I could not bear to hold in my head, and then I made coffee strong enough to argue with a judge. The next call was to a lawyer named Darlene, who wore a wristwatch the size of a communion wafer and had the grin of a former theater kid who learned the power of timing and never lost it. And in her office, I told the story not as wounded husband, but as narrator, because revenge is a language, and if I wanted to be fluent, I had to speak it without choking. She asked gentle questions that sounded like hammers cushioned in velvet. She said words I had only seen in movies about people who pay retainers without blinking. Discovery. Temporary orders. Community property. She said that judges do not care for poetry, and I should keep the part about the rotisserie chicken, but save it for closing, and I almost laughed, because that is how deeply comedy and grief had braided themselves. She slid a printed list of what to collect across the desk like a treasure map from a kinder pirate, and I saw in tidy bullet points the architecture of my life. Text messages, bank statements, location pings, proof of infidelity, proof of financial betrayal, proof that the children were sheltered even while the adults hosted a circus. I thought about how the word family can be a shelter or a trap, depending on where the doors are. The private investigator came recommended by the mail carrier, which sounds like a joke until you remember that in a neighborhood, the person who knows the most about everybody is the one who touches their envelopes. And he wore a baseball cap with no logo and asked to see my garage, because every man with secrets wants to stand in a room with tools. We built a whiteboard together that looked like a plan to rob a bank, but was only a plan to peel off the paint that had been laid over my eyes. He explained how to cross-check motel receipts with tower pings and how to translate the emoji grammar of a cheating wife into a courtroom dialect. He told me not to underestimate the Ring cameras up and down our street, because neighbors love to share evidence if you ask kindly and bring cookies. I told him I am not above a bribe that tastes like butter and sugar, and he said no one is. We set our first stakeout on a Friday morning when she told me she needed quiet time to journal, and I learned that in a certain kind of toxic love, journaling is a verb that means driving to a cheap motel named after a tree while the radio plays an uplifting podcast about self-improvement. The footage began to stack up in my laptop like chapters in a book that refuses to end. There she was, walking from my uncle's back door to her car with the urgency of a thief in a heist movie that ran out of budget. There he was, pulling his cap down and jogging across the lawn like a middle-aged sprinter who believes shame can be outrun. There were the same 2 cups on the porch table after every rendezvous, the same jacket thrown over the same chair, the same quiet choreography of a conspiracy so boring it felt insulting. When I confronted her gently, she tried to wrap the whole thing in therapeutic language that turned my house into a wellness retreat for liars. She said she was healing old wounds, that my uncle was helping her reclaim her body, that the affair was an accident of proximity, that American culture is too prude to understand advanced relationships, that monogamy is a corporate invention. I watched her build a religion out of inconvenience, and I realized that parody does not live on late-night television. It lives in kitchens where people try to rename the fire so they can leave the alarms turned off. I made a slideshow because I am an adult who believes in slides more than I believe in omens. And while the children were at school and the dog snored, I arranged the images into a timeline that felt like a necktie tightening. I titled it Timeline C because A and B had already been stolen by better decades, and under each date I placed the kind of evidence that makes a judge breathe slower. There was the night after yoga, when they both forgot that the yoga studio shares a parking lot with a liquor store that does not care who it sells to, but always remembers who bought. There was the Sunday he was scheduled to teach grilling safety to teenagers at the church, while she was scheduled to host a mother-daughter craft circle, and the only craft they completed was the ancient art of lying with bad alibis. There was an entire week when I took the kids to my parents and returned to find my wife's perfume living in the guest room like a temporary tenant with no references. I wrote notes to myself in the margins about cadence and tone because in America, performance is half of truth. News prefers motion, so the scandal ran laps around the cul-de-sac until even the recycling truck felt involved. Mrs. Jenkins from across the street sent me a text that said she was praying for our family, and also that she had an extra water bill notice for my uncle in case I wanted it for the file. Greg invited me to watch a football game and then paused the game every time a commercial came on to ask whether I planned to go for the throat or the soul. And I told him I am not a vampire, but I do own a calendar. The Parent-Teacher Association president asked if I wanted to talk to the school counselor because the cafeteria scene had startled some of the volunteers, and I said, yes, I will talk to anyone who believes microphones can be used for something other than karaoke. And I found myself in a small office with a mural of smiling vegetables telling my story to a woman who wrote everything down as if we were building a new alphabet from broken pieces. My uncle startled the neighborhood by posting on social media a long paragraph about how cancel culture is a witch hunt, and love is a revolution, and the body is a temple, and sometimes a temple accepts 2 priests, and then he posted a photograph of ribs on a smoker, because nothing says spiritual manifesto like meat that glosses in the light. The comments section split like a river encountering a stubborn rock. Some cousins wrote hearts. Some old friends wrote questions shaped like knives with napkins wrapped around them. I did not comment because silence can be louder than a crowd if you hold it with both hands. The investigator delivered his report in a binder thick enough to stop an arrow. He had tabs and I had highlighters, and we became the kind of team that works, not because we like each other, but because the goal is clear. We numbered the meetings and the motel receipts and the mornings she claimed car trouble while her car rested in perfect health 2 blocks away. We drew arrows not just between 2 lovers, but between their lies and my bank account, because betrayal often doubles as bookkeeping. I had thought the core of this conspiracy was desire. The binder suggested it was also logistics, like a delivery service for secrets. At the end of that week, I staged what my father called a porch tribunal and what my mother called a chance for grace, and I accepted both names because truth is large enough for 2 labels. We carried folding chairs outside and set them in a gentle semicircle, the way you set up for a backyard concert where the band is grief and the opening act is inconvenience. My parents sat with their hands folded in the old style of prayer. My wife arrived with a face that tried to negotiate its own weather. My uncle showed up 10 minutes late wearing a shirt that gave instructions to smoke the world, and I tasted metal in my mouth. I opened my laptop and began to narrate the timeline with a voice that felt borrowed from someone stronger and steadier, and every so often I looked at the children's bikes leaning against the garage and reminded myself that the story must serve them before it serves my hunger for revenge. When the video clips played, my wife said the phrase out of context so many times that the words lost bones and became slurry. My uncle tried to steer us into a debate about modern love as if he were auditioning for an old talk show about ideas. But I stayed with calendars and receipts because calendars and receipts do not blush. There was no applause. There was only the clicking of insects and the slow passing of a car with its windows down and a song about holding on when you cannot. She packed a bag that night and moved to a short-term rental with art that looked like furniture stores pretending to be artists, and he went back to his house and took a photograph of the moon as if it belonged to him. And I stood on the lawn under that same moon and felt the smallest turn of the earth. And for the first time since I held that sweating chicken, I believed that the center would hold if I centered it myself. Betrayal had made me a curator of proof. Infidelity had made me a student of pattern. Toxic love had taught me how to name poison without swallowing it again. And family, the real kind, the kind that looks like grandparents folding chairs and children's bikes, and neighbors who knock with pie, stood in the soft light, waiting to carry what could be carried. I went inside and put the binder on the counter like a heavy promise, and wrote on a piece of paper in block letters the words, "We will not be fools." And the dog exhaled as if to say that dawn comes regardless, and maybe that is the first mercy in a country that loves to watch and loves to judge, and sometimes, when you are steady and you refuse to bow to spectacle, loves to help. Courtrooms in America do not look like justice. They look like cafeterias that got a promotion. Beige walls, flags that sag like tired soldiers, fluorescent lights that hum with the resignation of clerks. But when I first stepped into the county courthouse, binder under my arm, I felt like a gladiator entering an arena where the lions wore neckties. The judge did not smile, because smiling is for humans, and judges are trained to resemble stone statues that have learned the art of sighing. My lawyer, Darlene, whispered, "Keep your answers short and your face long," which sounded like a haiku written by revenge itself. The case was simple if you looked at it like math, and impossible if you looked at it like family. Cheating wife plus cheating uncle equals betrayal squared. Infidelity minus secrecy equals spectacle. Toxic love multiplied by time equals property division. The judge asked me questions about dates and times, about the Ring camera videos, about the motel named after a tree. I answered as if narrating a PowerPoint to a stranger who had not slept in a week. My wife's lawyer wore a scarf patterned with scales of justice and used words like narrative and misunderstanding, as if betrayal were merely an inconvenient story beat in a sitcom that could be reshot next season. When the video played, the clip of her running from my uncle's back door like a ghost chased by sunlight, the courtroom did something rare. It laughed. Not loud, not cruel, but a ripple of disbelief that humans create when reality has the audacity to parody itself. Even the stenographer's fingers hesitated, as if unsure how to record humiliation in shorthand. My wife removed her sunglasses and stared at the table like it owed her money. My uncle did not attend. He sent a statement about privacy and progressivism, as if absence were an alibi. The court assigned custody schedules, split accounts, and left me with the house, which suddenly felt like a museum of betrayal exhibits. Every couch cushion whispered infidelity. Every hallway was a toxic love story written in invisible ink. The dog remained loyal because dogs are the last honest creatures in a family. I thought this was the climax, but conspiracy has no climax. Conspiracy is a hydra. Cut off one head and two sprout back, each holding a cocktail umbrella and a coupon for chain restaurants. The neighborhood reacted like extras in a movie who suddenly realize they are on camera. Mrs. Jenkins told everyone at church that the devil works hardest in cul-de-sacs. Greg organized a support tailgate in his driveway, complete with nachos, because in America, even betrayal needs catering. The PTA president asked me to speak at the school about resilience, as if surviving infidelity made me an expert in the same category as gym teachers and motivational clowns. I declined, but she put my name on the flyer anyway. The flyer had clip art of two hands shaking, which made it look like a business merger between grief and farce. Meanwhile, my wife reinvented herself online. She started posting cryptic messages about rebirth and empowerment, filtered selfies with captions like, "From betrayal blooms freedom," and "Toxic love cannot cage a phoenix." People liked the posts because people like anything with a sunrise emoji. She called herself a healer, as if infidelity were a workshop you could host in a Marriott ballroom. My uncle leaned into his barbecue persona, starting a podcast called Smoke and Mirrors, where he claimed grilling meat was a metaphor for relationships, low heat, patience, and a willingness to flip. He never mentioned me, but every episode sounded like a sermon aimed at convincing the world betrayal was just misunderstood hospitality. I might have ignored them, except their narratives threatened my children's sense of truth. I could not allow the story to be rewritten into parody without footnotes. So I launched my own campaign, less Instagram, more analog. I printed flyers with timelines, receipts, and screenshots. I slipped them into mailboxes like political propaganda, except the only candidate was truth. Neighbors opened them while sipping coffee and whispered at fences, "Did you see page 6? One man asked if I was running for office. I told him no, but maybe honesty deserves a ballot line. Still, even revenge becomes dull if it tastes the same every day. I needed escalation, a spectacle equal to the betrayal. That is when the conspiracy theories began to bloom, not from me, but from the community. Someone claimed my uncle was part of a secret society of suburban adulterers who met in basements decorated with IKEA lamps. Someone else swore the local yoga studio was a front for infidelity. That downward dog was actually code for betrayal. A teenager on TikTok made a parody skit about the naked wife alley sprint, and it went viral enough that strangers tagged me in comments, asking if I was the guy with the chicken. I became a meme. Revenge had leaked beyond my control. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat on the porch with Darlene, who had become less lawyer and more co-conspirator. She asked what victory would look like. I pictured a courtroom with confetti, my wife admitting cheating wife into a microphone, my uncle exiled to a desert with nothing but a broken grill. But the truth was smaller. Victory was simply not being played as a fool again. Victory was rewriting the parody into a script I could live with. She said, "Then you already won. The rest is theater." I looked at the binder, thicker now with memes and printouts, and realized she was right. Betrayal had become performance art, and I was both victim and director. But theater attracts audiences, and audiences demand sequels. So I staged one more act. I called a family forum at the community center, invited neighbors, cousins, even the pastor. I titled the event Transparency Night, printed tickets for free, and promised refreshments. The room filled with folding chairs and suspicion. I stood at the front with a projector and declared, "This is not gossip. This is documentation. This is how a family unravels when trust is treated like currency." I played clips, read text exchanges, and even displayed my uncle's barbecue podcast quotes alongside motel receipts, drawing connections so absurd they felt like satire. The crowd laughed, then gasped, then applauded. For one night, truth was entertainment, betrayal was theater, and revenge was sold out. When it ended, people shook my hand like I had given a TED Talk on infidelity. They carried the story home, retold it, embellished it, made it bigger. I realized that in this country, the only way to survive betrayal is to turn it into folklore, because folklore outlives humiliation. Folklore makes the fool into a prophet. That night, lying in bed alone, I thought about how conspiracy had woven itself into my grief. Maybe I exaggerated, maybe I became parody, maybe my toxic love story mutated into a carnival. But at least it was my carnival, and somewhere between exhaustion and clarity, I whispered into the dark, cheating wife, cheating uncle, betrayal, infidelity, family, revenge. These words will not bury me, they will brand me, and I will wear the brand like armor. The truth is that finales are not real in America. We crave them, we script them, we binge them on streaming services, but in real life they refuse to land neatly. And yet I will give you an ending, because endings sell better than ambiguity. It came not in a courtroom or a family forum, but in the middle of a 4th of July parade, the kind with middle school bands wheezing into brass instruments and fire trucks honking as if freedom itself were a car alarm. I was standing on the curb with my children, a paper flag in one hand and a plastic cup of lemonade in the other, when the float rolled past. The Chamber of Commerce had built a Spirit of Community tableau featuring volunteers tossing candy to the crowd. And there she was, my cheating wife, perched like a pageant queen in a sash that read, "Community Strong," waving at strangers as if betrayal were a civic duty. The crowd clapped politely. Clapped. My son whispered, "Dad, why is Mom on a float?" And I answered with the honesty of a man who has stopped fearing embarrassment. Because America lets anyone wave if they smile hard enough. Behind her, walking alongside the float in a chef's apron, was my uncle, handing out coupons for his new barbecue restaurant called Smoke and Mirrors. He winked at me. Betrayal had purchased advertising space in the parade of patriotism. I could have walked away. I could have swallowed the humiliation like an overcooked hot dog. Instead, I stepped into the street, lifted my phone, and projected the timeline video on a portable screen I had dragged in a Plowman. Yes, I brought evidence to a parade. Revenge is nothing if not mobile. The screen lit up with ring footage of her sprinting from his back door, with motel receipts, with captions bold enough to read from the back row, "Infidelity is not community." The crowd gasped, then laughed, then filmed. Fireworks cracked early from some overenthusiastic teenager, and suddenly it looked staged, like my life had turned into guerrilla theater sponsored by betrayal itself. The mayor, who was tossing frisbees into the audience, froze mid-throw. My wife's wave faltered. My uncle dropped his coupons. The band stumbled through Stars and Stripes Forever as if America itself could not keep tempo with this spectacle. Was it cruel? Absolutely. Was it effective? More than any sermon. Within hours, clips of the confrontation trended online with captions like, when the family drama hits Main Street and small-town parade turned soap opera. Strangers commented things like, "Toxic love has no holidays," and "Revenge tastes like lemonade." Memes sprouted faster than fireworks, each one framing me not as fool, but as folk hero. For once, betrayal had given me a gift, viral clarity. Of course, parades end, and when the floats disappeared and the confetti turned soggy in the gutters, real life crept back. My wife confronted me in the driveway, still wearing the sash. She screamed about dignity, about children, about forgiveness. I listened until her words collapsed into noise. I told her simply, "You wanted a stage. I gave you one. Cheating wives deserve spotlights too." She slapped me, then cried, then left in a car that smelled of cheap perfume and denial. My uncle posted a podcast episode titled "Freedom Means Choice," where he claimed grilling and love both thrive on experimentation. He received 2 sponsors and lost 3. Progress in America is measured in ad revenue. The children adjusted quicker than anyone. They turned the scandal into a board game they invented called Who Lied Now?, where each card was an excuse adults had used: book club, car trouble, self-care yoga. They laughed while playing, and I realized resilience is not taught, it is improvised. Family, broken and rearranged, still sat around the dinner table eating macaroni while the dog begged underfoot. Infidelity did not erase routine. Betrayal did not cancel bedtime. Toxic love might have poisoned the marriage, but the kids drank milk and survived. And me? I became both narrator and myth. People stopped me at the grocery store to ask if I really projected evidence at the parade. Teenagers requested selfies. A local reporter wrote an article titled, "When Revenge Becomes Public Service." My boss gave me a raise because productivity increased after I stopped pretending everything was fine. Even the judge mailed a short note that read, "You're not supposed to do that," but it was memorable. I pinned it to the fridge. Still, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world outside pretends to sleep, I feel the ache. Betrayal is not cured by applause. Revenge does not erase the scar tissue of infidelity. I lie awake sometimes, wondering how 2 people I trusted, one I married, one I admired as family, conspired to play me like a fool. The absurdity does not soften the wound. The parody does not anesthetize the loss. And yet absurdity is the only language I have left. So I talk to the moon like it is a courtroom witness. I rehearse conspiracy theories to the dog, who listens with more loyalty than any judge. I tell myself that toxic love is not destiny but pathology, that family can be rebuilt from smaller pieces, that revenge was not victory but rehearsal for healing. Sometimes I believe it. Sometimes I laugh instead. The cheating wife lives her new life online, filtered and rebranded. The uncle grills ribs and philosophizes about smoke. They will always exist in the town's folklore, but folklore cannot subpoena me anymore. I walk the sidewalks like a man whose shoes finally fit. My children ride their bikes without glancing back at empty driveways. The neighbors wave with the cautious respect reserved for people who have turned private pain into public legend. And maybe that is the real finale. Not the parade, not the courtroom, not the slideshow. The finale is survival disguised as ordinary Tuesday evenings when dinner is edible and the laughter is real. The finale is acknowledging that betrayal reshaped me but did not erase me. The finale is refusing to be the punchline unless I choose the joke. If you demand a line to close the curtain, let it be this: "They played me like a fool, yes, but fools in this country keep receipts." And sometimes, when betrayal burns too bright and toxic love tries to script your downfall, the fool gets the last standing ovation.